Hello and welcome to Guftagu. Today we have with us Kumkum Sangari. She's a feminist scholar and someone who's been involved with the feminist movement for a long time. But besides that, her work has been extremely wide-ranging, and in a way, if I introduce her just as a feminist scholar, is actually to limit the range of her work. Thank you very much, Kumkum Sangari, for your time and joining us here.
It's good to be here.
Frankly speaking, when Geeta had told me that you have to interview Kumkum Sangari on the range of her work, I was, to be very honest, extremely overwhelmed because it is truly an astonishing range from strictly literary studies to cultural studies to ethnographic studies. So maybe I could first start with your ethnographic studies in the northern belt of India, especially with respect to the oral storytelling tradition with respect to, say, for instance, Meera Bai. The kind of ethnography that you do looks at history in the present, and it does not, it sees the question of whether Meera Bai is historically accurate or did she exist or not exist as irrelevant. As someone who comes both from with a literary background as someone and as well as someone who comes from ethnographic studies, you sort of see history in the present as a living thing. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, partly yes, but not entirely, because I didn't actually do any kind of field research for Meera Bai. So it was not ethnographic in that sense, but it was based on an understanding of the fact that her song still lived. And I think I was beginning to think about oral traditions. You know, many of the songs attributed to Meera Bai, as I remember saying in that work, were composed by unknown men and women, and then written under the signature of Meera Bai. So the name itself seems to develop into a corpus, and that accounts for many of the different tenors in her, in her songs. You get actually sometimes quite conservative notions of, feudal, princely values, as it were. At other times, you get really sharp rebellion and sharp opposition. So even though it's sort of, and oral traditions, change almost with each performance. Right. So that each performer will bring, to it a new nuance, a little reinterpretation. And this would depend again on its migration from one linguistic region to another region. It would depend upon, the location of the performer, so that you get very different renditions amongst lower castes, of Meera Bai as opposed to upper castes. You get different renditions in Gujarat, in Uttar Pradesh, in Rajasthan. So there is this sense of, both selection and accumulation which is going on within an oral corpus, even though it has a single name attached to it. And I think that is something that we, get not just in Meera Bai, but in all oral traditions. I mean, the Kabir that you get, for instance, is so different in terms of regions. The more radical Kabir as opposed to, the more conformist Kabir, again depends on, region and performance and where the stakes are. But what is so interesting about Meera Bai is that her life is narrated very often, in hagiographies and in, popular oral lore as anti-patriarchal. So in some sense, that doesn't really, change. From the earliest written hagiographies, you get, an anti-patriarchal Meera, one who resists. So I think that, when you think about this, both the appropriation of her songs from more conservative positions, as well as actually further radicalizations of, the songs, then you begin to see that, Meera is a site of struggle between different social, groups and forces, depending on, the historical time period, the caste, the class, the region, and so on. So in some way, to think about oral traditions as producing a static, once and for all poetry, I think is misplaced. But it does speak of social energy. So what were these, profound social energies, that engaged, in this tussle over her name, exactly like the tussle over Kabir's name, who was much more iconoclastic and much more, for instance, the opposition to caste that Kabir, some of Kabir's songs show is perhaps the strongest that, we get from any pre-modern poet in the North. As for whether she really, what was her status as a historical figure, that is a very important question, because she, there isn't much written evidence of her life. And some of it might even be based on hearsay rather than on, contemporary accounts. But this is hardly surprising. I mean, most of the written accounts that we get, of ruling classes are of kings, princes, wars, marriages, succession. It's like saying that, subaltern groups must be represented somewhere in written history. They are not. So you have to actually read those historical accounts in part, which do exist, as well as see them against the grain in terms of how the songs were, circulating in different regions. Because the major writing of Kabir and Meera Bai was actually, at least almost over a century or two after they are supposed to have lived. So by that time, the songs have already become far vaster than any single person, could have composed, in a sense. And I think, when you want to think about what is real in that formation, what is real is the social energy of, constantly recomposing and transmitting those songs. And so you need, want to think not just of that historical figure, which is also very important, but also of, precisely these, very, very subtle activities of recomposition or reiteration that happened across such a vast period of time. And I think this whole question of, is there a real Meera Bai? I know some recent scholarship pretends that there isn't. But it's very doubtful that you could have, so much smoke without any fire.